Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heitinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, we host over 150 free programs, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. To find out more about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org, or you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation featuring curator and author William Cross, who will speak about the subject of his formidable book, Winslow Homer, American Passage. Today's conversation will once again be moderated by skilled moderator and host of the New York City-based Page Turner's Reading Series, Glenn Rauscher. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Nadine. As always, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Nadine and Rose and the National Arts Club for continuing to ask me to host these at-home events and trusting me with this wonderful series that they've created. It is a Wednesday night here in New York or wherever you are. And we know that there's 10,000 different places that you could choose to be other than here, and no one involved with this event takes for granted that you've chosen to be here with us. So thank you very much for that. Your reward is to have an evening with the author of Winslow Homer, American Passage, William R. Cross, or preferably Bill. As Nadine mentioned, we want to have you participate in our conversation with your questions. We do ask that you put your questions in the Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom screen. Very important distinction, please shape your thoughts in the form of a question. It makes it more likely that we will interpolate it into the event. We cannot get to all of the questions. We will get to as many as we can. And please note, if I do not take your question on the air, as they say, it is not personal. We will also not get to all of my 154 questions brought about by reading this book. Books are available for sale from Books on Call NYC, New York's only exclusively off-site bookseller. You can find the link to their bookshop.org page in the chat of this event. And part of the good news is that Bill is kind enough to offer to sign book plates for anyone who will purchase the book. The book and the book plates will come separately. You simply affix the book plate inside your book and you have a signed copy of American Passage. All formats are available, and please remember that for these events, there is a 2-book minimum, just like the drinks. And now on to our author for this evening. Beautifully navigating a fine balance between biography and art history, Bill Cross's American Passage is unquestionably the definitive account of Winslow Homer's remarkable life. Meeting the dual challenge of a subject who left little written detail of his life, travels, and thoughts, and when he did, engaged in misdirection and myth-making, Bill separates the legend from the actual man, and in so doing, reveals a genuinely legendary life, but a legend based on the reality of Homer's extraordinary accomplishments as an artist, and it gives him his rightful status as the equal of any American artist in any field during his time. The book takes us through turbulent and transformative times in the country and world, and interweaves dozens of major figures in art and society, and in each case, reveals what Homer drew from them and how all along the way he learned, mastered, and extended the art he immersed himself in. Bill will start our conversation with some of Winslow Homer's art and intersperse that with some people and places meaningful to this story. By the end, I think we'll all agree that this necessary reappraisal of Winslow Homer is most welcome. Please join me in welcoming Bill Cross.
Thank you so much. Glenn, for those kind words. And thank you, Nadine, for welcoming Glenn and me and for welcoming all of us here tonight. It's entirely appropriate that it is the National Arts Club which is hosting this virtual national launch of Winslow Homer, American Passage. Because the National Arts Club was founded by a friend of Winslow Homer's, Charles Decay, in 1898. And its goals were entirely consistent with the goals that Homer himself had. I want to welcome everybody who's here and thank you, as Glenn did, for your time and attention tonight. And I am hoping very much that the slides will work. The work of Winslow Homer, as in this beloved centennial picture, has earned him the title of America's favorite painter. The images from his hand are so familiar that even Americans who do not know Homer's name do know his work. As in this postage stamp. His pictures possess broad and deep appeal, but also tell profound, even troubling truths about our country. So it's just right that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has placed this painting at the center of its exhibition, Cross Currents, which opened April 11th. It is the most ambitious display of Winslow Homer's work in more than a generation. The luminous watercolors and spectacular oil paintings in this magnificent show reflect the role of tension, born of conflict, in Homer's work, particularly that made in his maturity. As a biographer, I focus on the man who created these monuments of our culture, but about whose life until now we have known so little. In examining his life and his art, I hope that all readers may find resonance with our own lives and times today. Born in Boston, to parents immersed in seaborne trade, even as a child, Homer was keenly aware of the economic, social, and moral tensions roiling the country, ranging from the Panic of 1837, a year after his birth, to accelerating antebellum division over the greatest moral question of the day, slavery. The Boston of Homer's childhood was hub to trade with ports across the whole Atlantic world, including most especially the southern states of the US. Most importantly for the Homer family, Mobile, Alabama, where 3 of Homer's 6 paternal uncles settled, 2 of them permanently. Exactly 1 year before Homer's birth, one of those uncles, whom he knew well because he ultimately settled in Belmont, Massachusetts, a stone's throw from the house that Homer's parents rented, was shipwrecked on the Bahamian island of Eleuthera, which is marked on this map, custom made for the new book. Years later, in 1885, as Homer first made pencil drawings and watercolors leading toward the Gulf Stream, he and his father would return to the site of that wreck. Homer began his career as a lithographer, or really a lithographic draftsman, working for a lithographic workshop. And he was doing a variety of projects there, including, as an example, memorializing an act of violence on the floor of the US Senate. There, shortly after Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered his speech, "The Crime Against Kansas," Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, beat him. Across the Prince top, Homer ran a quote from Brooklyn's Henry Ward Beecher, whose brother had been pastor to Winslow's mother at Boston's Park Street Church. "The symbol of the North is the pen. The symbol of the South is the bludgeon." And then Homer began designing wood engravings for illustrated newspapers, which were invented just 15 years earlier in London, and had now come to America. His designs were distinctive in their rhythmic geometry, their contrasts of light and dark, their humor and suspenseful narrative ambiguity. They often included a subtle nod to matters they seemed on the surface not to address. Here, for example, he depicts a watering cart intended to suppress dust on Boston streets, which just happens to stop outside the windows of the shop operated by the renowned abolitionist, Charles F. Hovey. At 23, Homer moved to New York, where Harper's Weekly snapped up his designs, especially after the long brewing Civil War broke out. And demand rose sharply for illustrated newspapers that could make sense of the distant but pivotal military action. Homer bore witness to the everyday drama of war, the life of the ordinary foot soldier, not the general. In so doing, he offered complex but accessible compositions that connected the men at the front to lives back home. He opens his narrative for the viewer to imagine the varied experiences of the war and to consider the outcome of the story Homer begins. Ever observing, he invites his own observers to share in his engagement with what he sees, to interrogate and complete it. He could sell a design such as News from the War for about $100, the equivalent of $2,700 today. In those days, the value of an oil painting like this one, Home Sweet Home, was similar. But Homer aspired to become not just an illustrator, but a painter. And for that, he needed to paint. With his success designing illustrations of life in camp, he turned naturally to that same subject in his first canvases, such as this one. He chose the title with considerable care. A man of few words, his titles were often as multivalent as his pictures. The subject of home permeated the Civil War for all those who had a stake in it, the enslaved who had no home, the Confederates who believed that only through secession could they retain their home, and the federal troops who fought ultimately for a larger mission, a reimagined home, an America anointed by God for his purposes. The war's end and Homer's success as an illustrator allowed him at last to travel to England and France, where he saw the work of painters his own generation, such as Manet, here painting an American Civil War battle waged in waters off the French coast, and the work of other European painters, living and dead, Turner, Constable, and Courbet, and Millet, here with his iconic Gleaners. Millet's inspiration is especially evident in the work Homer made in the rich, flat fields north of Paris. Upon his return to the US, Homer began the work for which he is best known. One of the ironies of his career is that before the late 1860s, this artist, now so closely associated with marine painting, had never made one. At 33, he exhibited his first oil of the sea, which he called Manchester Coast. The critics hated it, one writing that the most noticeable point appears to be the dashing of the ocean spray above the rocks. But as indicated by Mr. Homer, it resembles the work of a boy who has dashed a spitball upon a newly papered wall. The critic was displaying his ample ignorance of Japanese prints, about which Homer had already learned much from his friend John Lafarge, and which would very shortly become the rage in the United States. But to keep bread on his table, Homer needed to sell his work. With reviews like that one, unfair though they might be, this painting didn't sell. Homer never showed it again and crated up as best he could, both the picture and the sting of its reception. But most importantly, he did not give up. He stuck with marine painting, for which we all now can be grateful. He also made a series of pictures focused on children, often in or near their one-room schoolhouses, such as Snap the Whip. The year he completed this painting, Homer moved to the 10th Street studio building, a cultural hothouse where he lived and worked for 8 years until the spring of 1880. Homer engaged vigorously with others in New York's art world over these years, during which, as an example, he joined the Tile Club, a circle of architects, critics, and others in the arts who drank, smoked, gossiped, and, as time allowed, also painted handmade Spanish tiles, occasionally throwing them at one another in frustration. In 1873, surely encouraged by others in the 10th Street studio building, he journeyed to Gloucester, Massachusetts, near the site of his first exhibited marine painting, Manchester Coast. By summer's end, Homer had produced a suite of 10 watercolors he was willing to display, albeit with such hesitation that he gave none of them titles or prices. This suite of Homer's first exhibited watercolors was composed, like his wood engravings, of stark geometric shapes. The sheets embed a narrative ambiguity that draws his viewers into the stories Homer has begun, inviting their completion in the eyes and minds of those to whom he appeals. Some of the early watercolors reflect his affinity with Black children, such as this instance, one of many, of figures paired in contrast. He also empathized with indigenous women, men, and children, such as those around Lake St. John in Quebec. He saw himself in them, perhaps, as outsiders making their way on soil and water they cherished, and which their ancestors had known for centuries. Homer's outstanding talents as a painter in watercolor led him to create not only true masterpieces of American art, but among the greatest such works ever made anywhere in the world. They include radiant tropical sheets, of which there are many in the Met exhibition, and a series of dramatic sunsets that he painted on a return trip to Gloucester in the summer of 1880, when he lived with the lighthouse keeper and his family on 10-Pound Island in the middle of the harbor, immersed in the magical meeting of land, sea, and sky. That long, productive summer led Homer back to England, where he spent 20 months in 1881 and 1882, primarily in the North Sea fishing village of Cullercoats near Newcastle. There he painted this oil with its own Whistler-like picture within a picture. While he was in England, Winslow, his brothers, and their parents initiated a major new phase in the Homer family's life, and especially in his. The family bought a large chunk of Krakens Neck, a 150-acre promontory a dozen miles south of Portland, Maine, and Winslow remodeled a stable to become his home and studio. His first years at Krakens were ones of staggering productivity. Homer focused for the first time on the innate longing of all people for salvation, and on another theme that would engage him for another 2 decades of mid-ocean wreck and rescue, due in part perhaps to stories he heard on the deck of the Cunard steamship Parthia on his way to England. That led ultimately to a masterpiece seldom seen in the United States, but which is a part of the Met's exhibition and normally resident in Madrid. As mortal themes became central to his work, he created the famous contrasting pendants of the herring net and the fog warning, in which he sets a fruitful harvest of small fish that a pair of men catch close to shore against an uncertain outcome, as a solitary figure pursues large fish far out at sea at potential loss to his own life. A slump followed this period of intense productivity. Homer's slump became a depression. What turned things around was his return in 1889 to the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, where he had been inspired years earlier to depict a landscape in which another pair of figures appears, striking a contrast by age, height, and personality. This picture might well elicit questions later on tonight from Glenn or others, which I will welcome. Among Homer's happiest memories were of fishing in the early 1870s at the Clearing in Minerva, New York. Within the rustic bounds of this one-time Adirondack farm, now a club, Homer found both congenial companionship and confidence that the words of his favorite author, an Anglo-Scots physician, were true. Everything bears the mark of order impressed upon it by the almighty hand. Homer's newfound delight in God's created world in which he immersed himself was as tangible as the trout he painted. Homer sees in awe the working out of an invisible but benevolent design. The trout have sprung from the rippled, nurturing shallows for a brief moment, just as has their prey. He catches all of it in mysteriously ordered balance. The fish, the bug, the lily pads, and the air he too breathes. Homer relishes the suspense of the moment and its extreme brevity for the 3 characters in his drama. His sense of wonder did not mean that he was blind to vulnerability and death, but rather that he believed in the sovereign hand of God, that this side of heaven requires that we see through a glass darkly, in faith that one day we may see face to face. So in Homer's largest painting, Fox Hunt, it is not the ravenous crows with which he empathizes, but the tired old fox as, like the fox, his own signature sinks into the snow. And this, too, is working out of an order that is observed and attended by the Almighty, who made all creatures. Homer presents a tragedy for us, but he does not give away its ending. And he too cares about all that he, the human creator, has brought to life. This painting was one of several that before his 60th birthday had won Homer a reputation for work whose visual significance to our culture is as great as the contributions that Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and Mark Twain had made in literature. Despite the recognition his work received, Homer's life changed little. Over all that life, in his close observation, his idiosyncratic yet skillful hand, and his heart for all he encountered, Homer practiced the principles that he learned in his youth. He wrote that the life that I have chosen gives me full hours of enjoyment for the balance of my life. The sun will not rise or set without my notice and thanks. On behalf of myself and of this gentleman, thank you very much for coming tonight.
Wonderful, Bill. Thank you so much for that. I think I'm not alone when I say that it would be very, very easy for a viewer to get completely lost in the images. And then, of course, the beautiful way you described them. Thank you so much. I want to jump off something that comes up in the book and that you alluded to when you talked about the fox hunt is Homer not giving away the ending. One of the things that you talk about in the book pretty regularly is Homer trusted the viewer to interpret his work rather than spell it all out. You reference actually Dickinson's famous, perhaps somewhat overused quotation about tell the truth, but tell it slant. How did he accomplish that? Why did he do it? And what effect did it have on a viewer?
So he engaged in what his critics regularly criticized him for, so-called sketchiness. He was a masterful draftsman, but he would tend to leave many details undrawn, unpainted, so that the viewer could engage more vigorously with the picture that he presents, whether a watercolor or an oil painting or an illustration for that matter. And that narrative ambiguity leads us to ask more questions. Sometimes the questions make us uncomfortable, but Homer was brave enough to want that and to know that it would lead to good places. Does that help?
Yeah, and I'm curious. So one of the things that, because I think Homer's work has a very particular effect in drawing a viewer in, and there's a combination of both intent and technique. And I'm curious if you can speak to that specifically, like what he specifically did as an artist to make that happen. Because I think at one point he talks about, I see things and I want to record them, but obviously there's more than that as well, isn't there?
Yes. So it is both intent and technique. And one of the things that makes him great, I believe, is that he focused on what he wished to see and present within a frame that he sets. So he doesn't deny, for example, that there may be an ugly house outside his frame that he doesn't want to have in that frame. He doesn't deny the truth of that ugly house being there, but he sees no need to include that in his picture, which some other painters, such as Fitzhenry Lane, say, a great Gloucester painter, would have felt an obligation to present the cartographic reality of what was before his eye. So his intent is to focus on the appearance that he constructs, but it is a truthful appearance. So he doesn't move things around with so-called poetic license. He sets that frame with care, and this gets to the technique. He bases it on his training as an illustrator, where even when he doesn't acknowledge it out loud, there is a narrative quality. So as an example, many of his later marine works, rocky coast of Maine, waves crashing, might seem to have little narrative quality, little touch of human stamp. But look longer, look deeper, look broader. You will find yourself rewarded by more details that give you a reminder that this is a man who grew up making his living as an illustrator.
One of the things you just said, you used the word ambiguity and then the appearance that he constructs. We talked about this beforehand, and it comes up over and over again in the book. There's two aspects I think I would love to hear your thoughts on how you wrestled with as the writer of a biography. Number one, the dearth of documentary evidence that Homer himself left behind of his entire life. And when he did, and this is someone from our audience also asked this question, he was commonly, to put it charitably, misdirecting when he talked about himself, his life, his art. Can you tell me, as both an analyst of his life and a writer of this work, how that came across to you and what it meant in your particular challenge?
So you're kind to not mention another challenge, which is, by the way, there's been a pandemic going on.
Really?
So access to special collections in libraries like at Harvard University has been pretty negligible. And I had to rely for almost all this research on what was available digitally. And there were some special collections librarians at, as an example, Indiana University, that made those collections available despite the pandemic through special Zoom-based services that they dreamt up. Thank goodness for Hoosier ingenuity. But by and large, I had no access to any paper documents, even in format like that. And so what I needed to look for was whatever I could find from Homer's own letters or from the works themselves, many of which had stories embedded in them, stories based on inscriptions or provenance. But I also looked for diaries from people around him, which on rare occasion included his name. And I looked for newspaper clippings, and I looked for letters. For example, it turned out that there was a treasure trove of letters that shed light on his first trip to Europe. But those weren't by him. They weren't even by anybody that he knew. But happily, there were letters that shed light on him. But it was truly looking for needles in haystacks. And I'm grateful that the Times in which Homer lived were so rich, and that there were many sources of evidence of the world in which he lived, from which to make what I hope were intelligent inferences about the man and how he addressed that world.
Karen, who was one of our audience members, is asking, and this is sort of the second part, is she asked, do you feel Homer was deliberately elusive about revealing details of his own life because he wanted just to be judged by his works alone? Or was it something different? And I think you can also dovetail this. One of the things I love in the book is how canny a marketer he was.
Yes.
If you could talk about those two things.
So he was the great dissembler. And I believe that he saw the commercial benefits of his presenting a compelling myth. And he was also rather reserved, which didn't mean he didn't have friends. He had a lot of friends. And he benefited greatly from the friendships with both men and women, many of them younger than him, some of them older than him, who were quite important in his life. But the man sure liked his privacy. And I would say that his reserve was significant enough that it's probably fair to call him repressed and willing to live with a degree of self-constructed solitude for periods that he would choose and would interrupt with, for example, trips from his studio in Krakens Neck to Boston or to New York or to the tropics during the winter. And he would have plenty of social engagement when he made those trips. But he was more comfortable than the average person with solitude. I do think that as a part of his career as an illustrator, he learned about the value of the story, not just in his work, but about his life, and was comfortable presenting almost as a shield an appearance which was at odds with the reality. You never have any sense, for example, that over the 27 years that he lived for, in general, half or more of each year in Krakens Neck, that there were 6 or 7 hotels and boarding houses around his home. You don't see the hotels and boarding houses in his pictures, but they were there. And the nature of the population in not only Krakens Neck, but the town of Scarborough within which it sits was very dependent on the economics of those hotels and boarding houses. It was not a fishing village, but he would be very happy for you to think it was, because it helped with the myth.
I want to kind of link 2 parts of the book, and one of them is because it's a question from one of our attendees, and one of them who it's also a very area of special interest for me. But I want you to talk about the very, very beginning of the book. You begin the book with the apprehension and return of a fugitive slave in Homer's Boston.
Yes.
And you also speak or write about Homer's experience as an artist in the Civil War era, and how his art was different than the usual portrayals of the experience. Do you see sort of that in any way as linked? But I do want to ask you about beginning the book, where you began it, and then Homer's Civil War experience and how that was reflected in his art.
Yes. So for those who have not yet read the book, which I realize may be most people here, the book begins with a moment from Homer's boyhood. He had just begun working And he was a teenager. And another teenager arrived in Boston who was just about a year older than Homer. And despite his youth, he suddenly became nationally famous because the boy who arrived, named Anthony Burns, had escaped from slavery in Virginia and was tried for violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. This was an incredibly important moment in the history of our country. And I am sorry to say that many people don't know about the Burns trial today. And Homer would certainly have known about it. The attorney for Burns was a close neighbor of Homer's. And by the way, the author of 2 Years Before the Mast, who was a famous guy, Richard Henry Dana. And this was the moment at which it became clear that there was a choice that we as a country were compelled to make. And so from the spring of 1854, you know, it was still another 7 years before Fort Sumter, but Homer had an understanding of the brewing war coming, in part from recognizing that his family was deeply intertwined with trade to the South. And his own parents had significant differences over what their obligations were when faced with this economic system in which everybody, North and South, was involved, regardless of race, regardless of place. It was a system and it was insidious. So when the Civil War came and Homer had an opportunity to see the lives of the men in camp on the line, he was not only relating to them as fellow men who were confronted with mortal danger, he was also seeing this as a battle for the soul of his country. And he had had years to prepare for that. He was aided in this by his friendship with a remarkable man, classmate of his brothers at Harvard, who was enlisted in the army as a private and ended up as a general, and was Homer's sponsor on the front, Frank Barlow. And that process of identifying with the noble soul of Frank Barlow and other more complicated people, including a member of the Winslow family, and seeing the breadth of experience on the front line was very important for his formation. Does that help, Glenn?
Yeah, I think that you emphasize in the book that his art related to the Civil War was manifestly different than other art that was being made at the time, and I think that explains why. One of the other things that comes up in the book, labor, race, the role and prominence of women as reflected in Homer's art. David in the Q&A asks about, you know, how he focused on race and slavery in a very progressive and sensitive way. And he asks, can you talk about the evolution or change that's at work when contrasting the bright side with the Gulf Stream? And then when you answer that, I also want to ask specifically about the portrayal of women in his work, which I think is extremely unusual for that time. But I think contrasting those paintings would be a good way to talk some about his art as well.
Good. I don't dare share my screen again because I'm likely to break something. But let me take those in reverse order. This may be a contrarian view, but I find Homer's portrayals of women quite entrancing and meaningful. There are some people who view Homer's portrayals of women as less empathetic than of men. I don't buy that. I find him equally sensitive in portraying both women and men, and both boys and girls. It was not as easy for him to get female models, both women and girls, as it was for him to get male models. But I see him as very empathetic to women, and as somebody who I think probably thought of himself as a bit of an outsider, somebody who grew up poor, always worried about money, was never entirely sure of where he stood. I think he saw in women, as he did in many other parts of American society, people that he related to. And so as one example, some of his most imaginative illustrations he made for a remarkable and powerful, brilliant woman named Mary Louise Booth, who was the founder of Harper's Bazaar. And they're just in a class by themselves. And I think they reflect not only the leadership of Mary Louise Booth in providing a publication that was specifically intended to inspire women to lead richer lives of flourishing, but also the relationship that he had with her as one of many bright, dedicated women that he had a real friendship with. I also believe that he had an especial empathy with Black Americans, both those who had been enslaved and those who had not been enslaved. And he chose those subjects during Reconstruction at a time when that was not easy to do. It wasn't a great path to sell his work, but he felt like it was important work. And he documented first in 1873 when there was still hope for the success of Reconstruction, and then particularly in the centennial year, 1876, when it was pretty clear that Reconstruction was a failure and that the promise was a huge disappointment. He documented the tension that would succeed that failure, and which in some ways we continue to live with to this day. And so the work that he made in the mid-1870s, which addresses the fact of a multiracial country in which memories are many and strong and conflicting, and we can look at the same facts in different ways and have trouble making sense of those differences. He is honest about that in ways that we as a country needed then and need now, that honesty. And I hope that one of the things that happens with this wonderful show at the Metropolitan Museum is that people look longer together across their differences and talk about works of art, shoulder to shoulder, seeing the same work, and listening and speaking respectfully to one another across differences of race and age and income. We all have a lot to offer one another. And Homer is so accessible, and he's so truth-telling that I hope he invites all of us to find that common ground in that work.
One of the things that I think helped Homer appreciate all the things about his country, good and bad. You talk about the change in him when he left and then came back. I'd like to ask you, what was that change when he first goes to Liverpool and London and then eventually to Paris and France? And then he comes back a changed person. What happened while he was there, and how did it change how he saw his home country?
So,
and I'm sorry, and how he painted it after that.
Right. So that's a particularly challenging question to answer, because we have even less documentation for those 10 months than we do for the second trip to Europe. But we can make some reasonable deductions about what he saw. And we can also think about what he hadn't seen before he went to Europe. And I think that Turner was an especially important lodestone for him. When he left in 1866 to have his first trip to England and France, he happened to have left at the precise same moment that the American Watercolor Society was being formed. He left from Boston. The American Watercolor Society was formed in New York, but it was formed the very same day. Strange coincidence. If it is, maybe it's providence, not coincidence. And the American Watercolor Society was founded with a mission to provide to Americans watercolor of the quality that the English had had for a long time, and the respect that the English had given it was significantly greater than what Americans had given the watercolor medium. So one thing he came back from that trip with, I believe, was exposure in depth to watercolors that he didn't take up right away for exhibition, but that he saw, and advanced painting, which Manet and Courbet and others outside of the Academy were bold enough to exhibit on their own steam. And then painters from within the Academy, like Millet, older painters who had focused on the national identity of their country and had found ways to express that visually, which were commercially successful and artistically successful. So I think that experience of seeing the inventiveness of the painters of that day, and particularly with Turner, painters who had come before him, and the breadth of painting both in France and England and elsewhere gathered at the Exposition Universelle, including, as David suggested, two paintings of his own, Prisoners from the Front and The Bright Side. I think he probably was less interested in his own paintings than he was in the other paintings there. But I think that was an important moment. Did that answer the question fairly?
I think it does. Again, you keep saying good things that are stimulating questions that I've had, and actually some that some of our people watching with us have. You mentioned inventiveness, and you also, one of the things that comes across so much in this book is his curiosity and interest in things outside of himself. And again, maybe that came from his own desire not to reveal more about himself. You called it repression. We'll talk about that, I think, in a moment. But one of the things that became very intertwined in his work was photography. Howard is asking about how did the increasing spread of photography affect his career? And I want, if you don't mind, talking also at the same time, Homer loved music.
Yes.
And how did those two things, photography more towards his art, but also influencing how he viewed his art, and music, how did that play into Homer the man and Homer the artist?
I wish we had hours and hours more that we could talk.
I'll interrupt by saying to everyone who's putting questions in the Q&A, they're great questions, and there's absolutely no way we're going to get to all of them. We'll run out of electricity before we get all these questions, but they're excellent. Thank you. And I'm trying to get to as many as I can. So photography and music.
Yeah. So let me start with photography and more broadly invention. Both Homer's father and Homer's older brother were inventors. He grew up with an understanding that applied science mattered. When he moved into the university building, which was on Washington Square in New York, he moved into a building where the wires that Samuel F.B. Morse had hung from the ceiling, because he was experimenting with something that he would call the telegraph, they still hung from the ceiling. He was it was the same building was where Draper made some of the first American photographs. So Homer was keenly aware of invention, and photography was one of those inventions. So he used photographs to make a number of his wood engraved portraits, and those are well documented. He also used photography in some of the scenes that relate to events such as Lincoln's inauguration. But one of the things that is especially intriguing is that for the first time, we were able to identify an oil painting where he not only based it on his field drawings in graphite on paper, but on a photograph, a stereograph, which survives. It's very rare, but he was absorbing all of these influences from the world around him, and photography was one of those inventions. So it's not surprising that he owned three cameras, and that there are photographs, including from a Kodak pinhole camera, that survive to this day. Are they great works of art? Maybe not, but they're intriguing. And there are a couple that are in the book. So invention / photography is one part, music is the other. Homer understood the power of geometry, and specifically the golden ratio, which is of long time interest with both the visual arts and within music. There are harmonies that are particularly and intrinsically beautiful, and those show up in a number of Homer paintings. They also show up in Bach and in many other great composers. Homer had he was a high school dropout, but he had a keen interest in music, loved music, documented it as well as he documented anything, which wasn't very well, but at least it gives us encouragement to look longer, look harder. And I think that there are some great future articles and books that other people will write that connect Homer more deeply to music. At least that's what I hope. I've written this book not only for the intelligent layperson who I hope loves a good story, but also in the not too secret hope that there are lots and lots of graduate students who will pick it up and find it useful for their own research going forward.
Superb. I'm going to have some fun with a question that Ms. Reddy and in the Q&A are putting forward. She's asking, I'm going to change her question. So someone has decided that they're going to give you one Homer painting, but only one. Which one is on your wall this weekend after they deliver it?
Oh, wow. That's a very unfair one.
That's the only question to ask.
Well, I have a particular affection for a painting which is in the book, and it has not been seen in public for 24 years.
Mm.
I was, by contract, not permitted to include it in my talk tonight, nor to include it in any other talk.
Ah.
And I am so happy to say that if you go to the exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, that picture is there. And I cannot name the owner. In fact, I can't even name the painting. But it has been and remains it has been in private hands for 24 years. It remains in private hands. That's the one that I would like to be hanging over over our dining room table, but I'm highly confident that I will never get my wish, because after the show closes, it will go back to that private owner and may not be seen again for many years. And I'm just so grateful that that person has finally lent it to this exhibition. And I think that's additional reason to go see this show. Let me just give a hint.
Thank you.
That it is often grouped with the very important pair of the herring net and the fog warning. But it is a fundamentally different painting, and it's based on work that Homer did, which is documented in my book for the first time, when he returned to Gloucester, inspired by the true story of a man who to this day is a hero in Gloucester, Massachusetts, Howard Blackburn. Howard Blackburn, a folk hero in Homer's time and in ours, and the source of inspiration for one of America's greatest cultural monuments, which is now hanging at the Metropolitan Museum, and not for long.
I like how you answer both, doesn't answer the question because you can't, but makes people go to the Met, which is exactly what everybody here should do. We could go on. I still have there's still dozens of questions in the Q&A. I still have 30 questions here that I didn't get to ask. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered in writing this book?
Perhaps the depth of Homer's sense of gratitude for every day. This is a man who went through periods of profound sorrow and had real difficulty in making sense of his life, but by viewing every day as a gift and finding beauty in the ordinary, he found a sense of purpose and meaning that to me is inspiring and represents a flourishing. So, we've all been through a hard couple of years here. But if we view all circumstances as invitations to look differently, perhaps look slower and look longer, maybe we too can find, as Homer did, opportunity to give thanks and to realize that there is beauty to be discovered, and that within that we can flourish even and through the challenging circumstances we may confront.
I could think of no better way to end than that. So to everyone who's attended this, thank you so much. Please do use the link in the chat that is still up to buy this phenomenal book. And mostly to you, Bill, thank you so much for this book, for the gift of it, and for being here and having this wonderful conversation about this remarkable artist. It's been a joy to talk to you.
Thank you, Glenn. It's a joy for me too.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for this evening, and thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody, and I wish everybody a very, very good night, and take care.
Thanks.